All right, now let's move into discussing biosocial development in early childhood, section 2, where we will talk about motor skills development, and then some of the hazards that we face when we are raising a young child. In the area of motor skills, you will notice a couple of different patterns. Primarily from the age of 2 to the age of 6, you will see a pretty profound change in how well a young child can control his or her gross motor movements. So whereas a 2-year-old is just beginning to learn to run without falling and can do some basic climbing, by the time they are 3, they're able to kick and throw a ball, jump with both feet, pedal a tricycle, copy shapes, and even climb things that require more planning, such as ladders or tall play equipment. By the age of 4, the ability to coordinate different parts of one's body also improves, and pretty soon you can do things that show that your brain has started to lateralize. In other words, you can do things with one side of your body or the other side, or both. So you can hop on either foot. You can copy different letters. You can pour something while holding on to something else, using both sides of your brain together. We see improvements not only in gross motor, but in fine motor skills in young children. By the age of 5, we see children able to synchronize their motor movements either to rhythms that are going on around them or to be able to copy what other individuals are doing. Fine motor skills get even more refined, as you'll see on this list, and by the time a child is 6 years of age, fine motor skills have gotten good enough to be able to print certain letters, write one's own name, be able to catch a ball, and oftentimes engage in hobbies that will either include developing really good skills in like a sport or an artistic endeavor, such as drawing, painting, clay, or working with music. So during the early childhood period, the brain's maturing, and as a child gets interested in certain activities, that motivation can lead to increases in practice opportunities, thus resulting in better and better gross motor skills. So being able to practice is a critical part of growing these skills over time, and one's culture and the values that culture has for specific skills and activities is likely to impact the gross motor skills that you see in a particular child. In order to promote healthy motor skills development, there are a couple of things adults can do. First, adults need to facilitate a safe play space. For example, you may notice that many of the playgrounds we have around Fort Collins have those very, very soft, flexible surfaces underneath climbing structures, so that if a child does fall, he or she is less likely to hurt themselves because those spaces are so cushioned, unlike the sort of concrete playgrounds that I grew up with in the 70s. It's also important that adults make sure that young children have the time to play. Many people will discuss the early childhood period as being one where the work of the child is to play. So we need to have kids outside using their bodies, playing in lots of different ways in order for their motor skills to develop appropriately. Children need access to kind of the appropriate equipment to play on. So a safe swing set, for example, is a better option than maybe being swung inside by a parent where one could get hurt and hit one's head against the furniture. And the other thing that's really important for motor development is for a child to play in the presence of other children. Not only does this help because kids learn how to use their bodies through modeling, but it also helps because the social interactions require the child to learn how to respond quickly, how to time their motor movements, how to grade their motor movements, in other words, influence the pressure or the acceleration of their motor skills so that they can result in fun, playful interactions and not a lot of crashing and falling down. When you think about the kinds of motor skills games that we see preschoolers do, they are often geared exactly for the kind of stage of motor development the children are in. So think about Duck, Duck, Goose, which is a game you'll see in a lot of preschools where children sit in a circle and one child walks around the circle, patting the head of each child, calling duck, duck, duck. When they say goose, the child that they've patted and said goose to is supposed to jump up and chase them. That one game involves using your motor skills with your language, touching and saying duck. It also involves a sequence and repetition, which is how motor skills get better. It involves being able to know just how hard to tap on a friend's head. You don't want to slap their head when you say duck, you want to touch them gently. So it gives you practice in grading. And then it also allows you to have inhibition practice. You're practicing waiting. Not every child's going to be called on with goose. So when your head's being tapped, you have to inhibit jumping up and chasing the other child. Running around in a circle, well within the skill set of most 3 to 6-year-olds who are mobile. So the games that we play, the spaces we play them in, and doing them with playmates at a developmentally appropriate pace is a really good way to develop solid motor skills in young children. Now, fine motor skills are a bit more difficult to master and often require a lot more practice. So you may recall these involve your small hand and finger movements. Both sides of the brain have to be recruited, and the brain has to grow into readiness for these behaviors. So practice can really only work once the brain is ready to support those fine motor movements. For example, early on, as children are learning how to use their hands, they may be doing finger painting as a way to express themselves artistically, and they don't have to hold a tool, they can use a whole hand. Over time, that drawing or painting skill can include a brush or a crayon and get increasingly more challenging in being smaller or have a farther distance between the child and the art they are creating. In general, artistic expression can be a great way to build fine motor skills in children, and creative activities are a wonderful way to engage a child because it's something they can do together with adults and other children, help them develop socially, as well as be just a really nice, calming leisure activity. So in conclusion, in motor development, we do have a predictable set of skills that we expect to see at certain ages. Brain maturation and practice is what's going to contribute to an individual child's trajectory in those skills. Now let's turn to our final section for Chapter 8, the part on health hazards for young children. First, we're going to talk about environmental hazards, such as pollution. Now, while all of us are affected by toxins that may be in our air or our water or our food, we're particularly concerned about pollutants when it comes to the development of young children. So young children with growing bodies and brains are more vulnerable than older children to pollutants that are in their air, water, or overall environment. This turns out to be of particular concern in the United States for children who live in cities or are from families who are relatively poorer than other families. Part of that is related to the idea that many communities that include lower income families may be closer in proximity to health hazards such as waste treatment plants or power plants that are producing waste. These sorts of environmental hazards tend to impact children from poorer families more significantly, and some of the ways that that comes through is by increasing their risk for asthma and other breathing problems. Now, it turns out there are hundreds, if not thousands, of substances all around us that could impact brain development, and as we grow older, our bodies tend to be better prepared for protecting us from those pollutants. But young children actually consume more air, more food, and more water per pound of body weight than older children or adults, and their organs are still developing. So the combination of those two factors make them particularly vulnerable to environmental hazards. Now, we've gotten better as a field at testing for these environmental hazards, and we can even test at a molecular level. So if a pediatrician becomes concerned about a child's exposures, we can find out if those exposures are impacting the child's development in most cases. One example of a pollutant that has had a devastating effect actually on child development and has been studied quite a bit is the impact of lead poisoning on the brains of young children. So approximately 100 years ago, we discovered that lead was toxic. It was poisonous to the human body. However, lead was included in a lot of household items, common items, like it was in house paint, so therefore it was on the walls of many homes. It was in automobile fuel, for example, until the mid-90s. So over time, children who were particularly young, living in poor neighborhoods, living in housing which was old and maybe had lead paint, were more likely to be at risk for lead poisoning. Young children, particularly infants, are most vulnerable to lead's toxicity and have a very difficult time clearing the lead from their bodies. Children who were exposed to lead at younger years have been shown to be at risk for growing up to be teenagers who are more impulsive in their behaviors, and in fact, lead exposure has been linked to rates of violent crime in older adolescents and young adults. Lead is particularly concerning when it comes to its impact on learning new material. So in several studies of lead poisoning, also referred to as plumism, we've been able through neuroimaging to see that high lead levels in the blood is contributing to reduced size of blood volumes in the brains of adults. So as you might be able to see from this picture, those red and yellow hotspots are areas that are smaller than they should be in the brains of people exposed to too much lead as young children. So you'll see spots all around the brain. Things like in the bottom right, that in the cortex there, that would impact the speed of thinking or being able to formulate ideas. If you take a look at on the right side, the second brain from the top, what you see there are problems in the midbrain, which is where balance and regulation of a lot of things like breathing and swallowing could be affected. If you take a look at the top left corner, you see red and orange in the frontal lobes. That's where you may see lead poisoning impact attention, language, and emotional regulation. So lead poisoning can have far-reaching effects in the developing brain. One of the most tragic examples of this phenomena has been relatively recent, and that's the case of Flint, Michigan, where in 2014 the leaders of the town changed the water source to a contaminated water supply. They didn't know initially that it was contaminated, but there were problems in lead leaching through the pipes that for years children and families were being exposed to lead through their county and city water. Many health professionals were the first to draw everybody's attention to this problem. In fact, it was just a couple of pediatricians who noticed that more and more children were demonstrating slower learning, problems controlling their impulses and their emotions, and started to order tests and discovered that lead levels were way too high. It was the advocacy of these frontline health professionals that brought this critical public health concern to the authorities and thus led to a long and still not completely resolved process of trying to make things better. Amelioration of a problem like this, fixing something like an entire city's water system, is a complex endeavor, but one of the things that we have learned, sadly, from the Flint, Michigan water tragedy is that chronic ongoing exposure to lead in the water has resulted in learning problems that interventions are not yet able to reverse. So while we see some children improving with enriched education and obviously making sure they have clean water, we see a significant portion of the children who will probably be living with lifelong consequences of lead impacting their brain development in adverse ways. And when I say adverse consequences, the most common finding we'll probably see is an increase in the intellectual disability population. So the percent of children who have an IQ of under 70. And that means that they will always learn more slowly than their peers. So public health hazards can have a lifetime impact on the developing brains of young children. Another really important area for us to consider is injuries and the potential for abuse. Both very important health hazards for us to try to both prevent and, if we experience or observe them, to intervene. Now, accidents are the kind of thing that can happen randomly. People can do their best to protect a child's health and well-being, and accidents can happen. In fact, more children die from accidental or deliberate violence than any specific disease. So these sorts of physical hazards are really important for people who study child development to be aware of. There are avoidable injuries where we can work on ways to keep a child safe. So for example, motor vehicle deaths can be prevented by installing healthy car seats in cars, which has been a movement for several years now. Things like falling, poisoning, fire, or drowning, those can be prevented with vigilance and supervision, but also may be helped through monitoring devices or locking things away from children. When we think about injury prevention, we can think about 3 levels. There's primary prevention, secondary, and tertiary. So primary prevention, those activities include things that everyone can do in the background for everyone. So these are things like making it a law that all cars have car seats. That's a primary prevention action. It tries to figure out what are the risk factors associated with injury. Motor vehicle accidents, okay, how can we keep infants safe? Let's give them a car seat that would keep them safe if anything were to happen. Secondary prevention are actions that we take when we know there's a high-risk situation and we want to try to prevent it from resulting in injury. So an example here would be if a community discovers that a particular intersection tends to have a high number of car accidents, they would decide to put up a stoplight or a stop sign in order to prevent that high-risk situation from resulting in injury. And lastly, there's tertiary prevention. These are things that are actions that we take once the child has already had the bad thing happen. So the injury has happened, but we might know that if we take prompt action, we can reduce the extent of harm or prevent the injury from having a long-term disabling consequence on a child. So for example, in poisons, if a child ingests something that is poisonous, we have different treatments such as Ipecac, which can be given to the child immediately so that the poison can be eliminated from their body and hopefully not have long-term impact. And now for the last part of Chapter 8, let's turn to a really difficult topic, and that is the topic of child maltreatment. Child maltreatment is an umbrella term that we use to describe any intentional harm or avoidable endangerment of anybody under the age of 18. There's 2 kinds of child maltreatment. There's child abuse and child neglect. Child abuse is defined as a deliberate action that is harmful to a child's physical, emotional, or sexual well-being, whereas child neglect is a failure to meet a child's needs in the areas of physical, educational, or emotion. Child maltreatment will be discussed by child welfare professionals as either being substantiated or reported and it's important that you understand this distinction. Substantiated maltreatment is when someone has reported that harm or endangerment may be occurring, and the authorities have investigated those reports and have verified that yes, the maltreatment is occurring and therefore something will be done about it. Reported maltreatment is at the stage where an observer has reported to the authorities that harm or endangerment may be occurring. It's suspected, but the authorities have not yet concluded their investigation and thus have not yet verified or eliminated the idea that maltreatment is occurring. So it's very important to keep that in mind. If you decide to go into a field that involves working with children, such as being a teacher, working in childcare, being a physical therapist, a psychologist, any kind of a child welfare sort of person, you will become what's called a mandated reporter. That means that if you see any child who appears to have gone through some kind of abuse or appears to be neglected, that you are not to do the investigation yourself or make a decision about whether or not it's happened. You aren't to sort of think through the reason why. You are just to be a mandated reporter, meaning you are required to contact the authorities, which is your local child welfare office, and describe your observations. It is then up to the child welfare workers to conduct a screening and determine if further investigation is needed. So I know you'll cover this in other classes. I just want you to keep in mind that it is really critical that you take this role very, very seriously. You are a legally mandated reporter if you have a job that is very specific to child development. However, as a human being, say you see something in a neighbor's child that you have concerns about. You may not be a legally mandated reporter, but one could argue that morally you owe it to the child to contact the authorities, because we can't do anything about abuse or neglect of a vulnerable person unless the system knows that it's happening. So do keep that in mind whether you decide to go into child work or not. Now, interestingly, we've been tracking maltreatment since the early 1900s, and what we've seen is that reports of maltreatment are increasing, but the substantiation of those reports, the verification, have been decreasing. There could be a couple of reasons for this. There are fewer homes with multiple small children, thus a bit more feasible to take care of them. There's also a lot of variation between how much scrutiny is placed on these investigations. Some communities do a really good job of investigating thoroughly. However, there are concerns that some communities do not take some reports seriously enough. Thus, the substantiated rates may be decreasing because we're not doing a good enough job of investigating. It's also possible that maltreatment continues to be underreported, thus requiring that we all remain vigilant and looking out for children who may not be being treated appropriately. The warning signs of abuse and neglect in general. Maltreatment has long-term consequences, as you might imagine. These affect the child, the family, and the whole community. In fact, decades of research have shown that mistreated or neglected children do tend, as they grow to be teenagers and adults, to see others as hostile and potentially dangerous. That lack of trusting can evolve in a less friendly personality. A teenager or a young adult may be more prone to aggressive behaviors, may be more isolated from others across the lifespan. Individuals who've survived mistreatment or neglect tend to have slower development in their social skills, either because of a lack of practice or possibly because that chronic stress has actually impacted the brain pathways that help us become more social creatures. And individuals who have this in their background may find it very difficult to have the kind of persistence inside themselves, as well as the social support of others, to come up with a vocational or educational goal and to be able to persist in their pursuit of that goal. This can then result in long-term economic consequences, that the person doesn't have the resources they need to function well in the world. So mistreated and neglected children face a lot of challenges socially, emotionally, as well as in their overall health and well-being as they get older. Now, in the area of maltreatment, we have things we can do to prevent at various levels, and different communities may do these things better than others, but it's an area of growing concern that our education and our child welfare systems are resourced well enough to be able to identify children who are going through this and to provide the kinds of prevention we need to keep our children healthy. So at a primary prevention level, you have people working towards helping families stay strong, helping to reduce things like parenting in adolescence, which has been associated with an increase in maltreatment because of the difficulties in impulse control that a teenager has even prior to becoming a parent. So primary prevention is about building up strong neighborhoods, helping families stick together, reducing economic stress. All of those things can reduce rates of maltreatment. Secondary prevention has to do with focusing on those who are at risk. So there are many programs, for example, that have been developed to help families where there is an insecure attachment between the young child and the parent. By providing some additional parent coaching or intervention, when we're signaled that there's an insecure attachment, those families can learn ways to build a stronger relationship with their child, and then hopefully also prevent aspects of maltreatment. And then third, there's tertiary prevention, which is focusing on limiting the harm. So once we've known that maltreatment has occurred, what can we do to try to limit the effects on the child? So this tertiary prevention is often focused on placement in the area of maltreatment. Permanency planning is the process where child welfare authorities really strive to come up with a long-term living situation which will give stability and support to a child who's been through maltreatment. Whatever can be done to keep the child in as much constancy as possible, in other words, in the same school system, if possible, in the same family, in the same neighborhood, those things are thought to help reduce the amount of harm after maltreatment. Some of the placement options that may be considered are foster care, which is where the public system identifies and trains an entrusted adult who doesn't usually have a relationship with the child ahead of time, and then that person takes care of the child during this temporary stage while perhaps the biological family is going through some interventions that will enable them to demonstrate that they can now safely take the child back. Kinship care is when the child is placed in the care of a relative, maybe a sibling, maybe a grandparent, maybe a cousin, somebody who can help maintain the family ties, but is a safe person who is not the abuser or the maltreater. Sometimes kinship care can be permanent. Sometimes it is temporary until the biological parents, with intervention, demonstrate the ability to safely care for the child. And then the last option that we're covering today under tertiary prevention and placement is adoption. Once all of the other options have been tried and the parents have not been able to demonstrate the ability to take care of the child safely, adoption may be the next route. And adoption is defined as a time when an infant is legally given over to another person who will be their permanent parent and have legal guardianship rights until the child is an adult. So in summary, what we've tried to cover through Chapter 8 is looking at how the biosocial development of the young child helps to set the trajectory for the health and safety of older children, adolescents, and adults. So this is a pretty critical period for thinking about health and welfare. We've talked about growth changes, brain development, hazards including child abuse, child neglect, otherwise known as child maltreatment, and we've also covered motor skills development. And with that, I'll close our lecture, and I encourage you to do your Launchpad activities and complete your practice quizzes. Thank you for your attention.